Hey everybody, this is Sean from Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deck guide. This time, a long time in coming, and that is Metalwork Colossus. Now, Metalwork Colossus is kind of a janky artifact ramp combo deck that has some control elements to try to keep itself alive and a little bit of beatdown elements to keep your opponent honest. Now, by ramp, it's not really a traditional ramp deck. What it does is Metalwork Colossus is an 11 mana 10/10 that basically has affinity for artifacts. Only it's artifact mana value for non-creature artifacts rather than, just traditional affinity. To that end, you play a ton of kind of underwhelming and artifacts that are either equipment or ways to recoup card advantage to get yourself to Metalwork Colossus, ideally casting multiple Colossi on turn 4. Metalwork Colossus can be found if you have one. You can use it to find any Sanctum of Ugins you happen to have in play, sack them to find another Metalwork Colossus, and so on and so forth. You also use things like Glint Nest Crane and Ingenious Smith to dig for them, as well as other artifacts to keep the ball rolling. And then a little bit slower of a method, but Inventor's Fair, if you have 3 or more artifacts, you can pay 4, sack it to go find an artifact of your choice. Generally, it's going to be Metalwork Colossus. Now, the rest of the deck, you have things like Portable Hole, Glass Casket to keep your opponent honest, disrupting their strategy, especially if they're an aggressive deck. You use things like Snare Prototype to accelerate you, Witching Well to kind of filter your draws along with your Ingenious Smiths and Glint Nest Cranes. Wedding Invitation and Prophetic Prism are cantrips that have additional effects in the mid to late game. Gilded Pinion is one of those kind of janky equipments that we talked about. Whenever it enters the battlefield, create treasure tokens that adds to your ability to cast your first Metalwork Colossus, and you can also equip it to give your Titan flying. Important because, well, Metalwork Colossus, while it is a 10/10 beat stick, does not have trample or evasion. Beyond that, Haunted Cloak. Equipped creature has vigilance, trample, and haste. Means you can attack and block in the same turn, trample with it, and give it haste. Obviously important. Brass Knucks. This is kind of a garbage permanent that, unless you played Streets of New Capenna Limited, you probably wouldn't know much about. It is a 4 mana artifact that copies itself whenever it's cast. An equipped creature has double strike as long as 2 or more equipments are attached to it. Only costs 1 to equip. Basically, this effectively allows you to cast 8 mana worth of artifacts, non-creature artifacts. Pretty much meaning the turn you cast this, you're almost assuredly going to be able to cast Metalwork Colossus. One of the other things this particular version has is a 1/of Barricade Breaker. Now, this isn't the best of artifact or best creature, but it has improvise, which means you can tap your artifacts to help cast it. And it is a 7 mana thing, which allows it to trigger Sanctum of Ugin, giving you 1 more thing in your deck that can trigger Sanctum of Ugin besides your copies of Metalwork Colossus. Also, it helps to have another beat stick in your deck in case your opponent has some type of Stone Brain effect or extraction effect. Mana base, nothing too fancy. 1/of Otawaru. You have a couple copies of Inventor's Fair and Sanctum of Ugin we've already kind of talked about. Kind of help to tie the deck together. And then, a bunch of blue-white duels and a few basics. Sideboard, this particular version, you get to run Gigantha, which is nice. Although it can be a little bit difficult to cast, as I believe this particular version, I forget where I pulled this deck version from, but I don't think you can actually cast Gigantha, which was a bit of an oversight of whoever designed this particular version of the deck. Additional copies of Glass Casket helps to slow down the aggressive decks. Once again, your key turn with this deck is turn 4, so you need something to help keep you alive. Metallic Rebuke when you need to fight against control and combo decks, slow them down or disrupt their key piece. Antiquities War is an alternative win con that allows you to dig for artifacts, and then on Chapter 3 turns everything into 5, all your artifacts into 5/5 creatures for till the end of turn, allowing you to Alpha Strike for the win. Pithing Needle, just another artifact that plays into your strategy, but can also shut down annoying things like Teferi or Liliana. Can shut down things like Thespian Stage, so it's quite nice in that regard. Damping Sphere helps to fight against Nykthos Ramp and Lotus Field combo. Finally, Unlicensed Hearse, a little bit of graveyard hate for your Grease Fang and Is It Phoenix decks, which can be a little bit faster to set up than you. Taking a look at some other cards, other variants of the deck. Another pilot recently that did well, or streamed the deck, I believe, ran the Iron Crag. This is a mana rock that can transform into equipment that you can equip, although I'm not really sure you would want this to transform. It's just a nice mana rock that basically reduces the cost of your Metalwork Colossus by 2, and then you can tap it to add a 3rd mana, and then 2 mana artifacts are not really that common in the Pioneer format. Sideboard, Soul Guide Lantern, once again, more graveyard hate similar to Unlicensed Hearse. Shadow Spear, I'm not really sure why this isn't included in more of the builds, other than the fact that it's only 1 mana, so it's not all that good. Witch's Oven, bit of a bizarre one. I think this is mainly to blank exile-based removal your opponent might be bringing in. Whether it be stuff like Leyline Binding, things like, basically any type of exile effects your opponents might have. This kind of puts the Metalwork Colossi back in your graveyard. Damning Sphere Road kind of covered. Karn, Scion of Urza, a similar alternative win con, much like Antiquities War, only this one you use for card advantage, and then you can create constructs or card structs with it that basically have power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts you control. One thing I did forget to mention with Metalwork Colossus is you do have the ability to bring it back from the graveyard. You can sacrifice 2 artifacts, return Metalwork Colossus from your graveyard to your hand. This enables you to rebuy your threats, although sacking too much of your board may make it very difficult to recast. Final variant showcases a couple of unique cards to this particular version. Prophetic Prism we've already kind of talked about, along with Wedding Invitation. This one would make more sense to be running your copies of Gigantha with, as it allows you to filter and be able to cast Gigantha, and of course this version is running Gigantha, which is kind of foolish. The Celestus allows you to filter through your deck. The 3 mana artifact that reduces the cost of your Colossi, also helps to cast your spells, and then you can use it to flip between day and night to be able to filter through your deck, find your missing pieces. The Mightstone Meekstone is a 5 mana artifact that serves either as a cantrip and allows you to cast your non-artifacts or cast your artifact spells much more cheaply, or can be used to kill most creatures in most opponents' decks, whether it be things like Shieldred on down. Very few things in the format can survive -5/-5 in the format currently. One of the few things being Cavalier of Thorns is the one that comes to mind. The thing this version gives up is you lack Ingenious Smith and Gluttonous Crane, so you're a little more dependent on the more control game, just really relying on Metalwork Colossus to win the game in that regard. Sideboard, all the same things you've seen, but Padim, Council of Innovation, beginning of your upkeep, if you control an artifact with the highest mana cost or tied from the highest mana value, draw a card. Also gives your artifacts hexproof, nice one of to force your opponent to be able to interact with it first before interacting with your permanents. And then Weathered Runestone, non-land permanents in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. Doesn't stop your Metalwork Colossus from coming back to your hand with its ability, but does shut down things like Arclight Phoenix and vehicles from coming back from your opponent's graveyard, and also can make cards like Collected Company and Kaya's Reconstruction kind of a joke. And that is taking a look at most of the versions of Metalwork Colossi. Some versions have tried to run Karn the Great Creator. The problem with the deck is it doesn't have a lot of creatures, not really a lot of ways to defend it. So Karn the Great Creator, probably not the best card to add to the deck, although there have been some versions that have tried to run it. The power of this deck, obviously, turn 4 you can drop 2, 3, 4 copies of 10/10s, and then if you happen to have a free mana, you can equip your Brass Knucks or your Haunted Cloaks and start going to town. The downside is, by Pioneer standards, that's a little bit slow. Most of your good aggressive decks, whether it be Boros Heroic, Blue-White or Azorius Spirits, Mono-White Humans, Mono-Red, generally can Goldfish turn 4, turn 4.5. So sometimes 10/10s on that turn just aren't that good. And then you obviously have decks like Mono Green that can be doing absurdly broken things by turn 4. So this deck is a little slow by Pioneer standards, but is a blast to play, and the look on your opponent's face whenever you're dropping Metalwork Colossi can be quite hilarious. The other thing the deck is a little bit vulnerable to is obviously it can grind through some amount of removal. Now, a lot of removal in the format can't touch Metalwork Colossus. Things like Fatal Push, Bone Crusher Giant, Portable Hole, Abrupt Decay. There's a lot of removal spells that can't touch Metalwork Colossus. Now, Heartless Axe, Shoulder's Edict, those cards can touch it, but they're not that big a deal in small numbers, as you can kind of grind through that. The problem becomes exile-based removal, Leyline Binding, Farewell, anything, was it Sun, new 5-mana sweeper that sees some amount of play. But basically anything that exiles your creatures can be a problem. That's why you saw some copies of Witch's Oven to be able to sack Metalwork Colossus in response to something like a Leyline Binding. So kind of get a little bit creative against exile-based removal, but you do have a little bit of a grindy plan and some decent sidestep plans in either Karn's Sign of Urza or the Antiquities War in the sideboard, depending on what you feel like running. And that is Metalwork Colossus. We will have at least one gameplay video with the deck coming out to give you some idea of how it's played, as really the content for this deck is kind of few and far between, as it's kind of a very fringe deck in the format, but still fun to play. I know Amio has done some work on this deck recently. A few other people have played it over the years, Saffron Olive on Budget Magic and such. This deck is obviously very budget friendly, with the exception of the mana base a little bit, because you're playing a bunch of commons and uncommons and 4 copies of Metalwork Colossi. So if you like a budget-friendly kind of casual deck that you can take to F&M or, kind of show up to random tournaments and do okay with, potentially, spike a top 8 or something, but wouldn't expect this deck to contend well on a regular basis, but is still a fun deck you should be aware of, and is a little bit off the wall. So if you like these kind of decks, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.